Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I think we still have some guests joining, but we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you who are joining us from outside the United States. Welcome to International Medical Corps' briefing to discuss the ongoing crisis in Sudan and how International Medical Corps is helping families whose lives have been upended by the fighting. I'm Rebecca Milner, International Medical Corps Chief Advancement Officer, and we are delighted that you've taken the time to join us today. Many of you on the call are generous supporters of our work, and we are incredibly grateful for your trust and commitment. And we can't do this work without you. Your support makes it possible, so thank you. We're going to keep today's briefing as efficient as possible. We'll wrap up well before 45 minutes. Toward the end of our conversation, we will take a few questions. So as we talk, please feel free to type your questions in the Zoom Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them. I'm sure you are all well aware of the conflict in Sudan and how it spilled over into the neighboring countries. It all escalated in mid-April with clashes between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. The conflict erupted in Khartoum and has spread across the country. Official figures cite more than 1,000 people who've been killed. Thousands more have been injured, and an estimated 480,000 people have fled Sudan to neighboring countries, while more than 1.4 million have been displaced inside Sudan. To date, no diplomatic efforts have been successful, and fragile ceasefires have failed. We're fortunate to have our colleague, Dave Eastman, Senior Director for International Programs, join us today to give us an overview of the situation and share how International Medical Corps is responding to the crisis. Thank you for joining us today, Dave. Let's go back a few years. There were high hopes for a democratic government when the longtime President al-Bashir was forced out amid civilian-led protests in 2019. But that fragile civilian government didn't last. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened? How did we get from that promising end to al-Bashir's dictatorship to an all-out civil war here in 2023?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And just again to say thank you to everyone for your support to our organization. It's your support that enables us to move quickly when the United Nations or even our government donors are still deciding what they would like to do. It's your support that enables us to really do those life-saving, immediate services when conflicts are at their most intense. It gives us that flexibility, so thank you for that. So we thought we would catch you up on what's happening there, what we've done, and to catch you up then on the political situation in Sudan. Darfur has been in our memory, all of us who care about humanitarian work. Darfur has been in our memory for decades, and it remained an issue. People were still displaced, and there were still challenges to people living in camps in Darfur. Sudan was already a very challenging context for us to work in. We've been there since 2004. And even as recent as last year, we were working in a context where since the peaceful transition, it was then taken over by two military groups who are now in conflict. And they had a very tenuous agreement between the RSF and the RAF, the Ethiopian military force. And essentially, the military was...
Sorry, you mean the Sudan military force?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sudan.
Yeah.
So those two forces essentially were running the government. And so any kind of administrative decision or any kind of approval that you wanted, for example, imports of medicines for the support that we were already providing to 68 health facilities across Sudan, was really difficult. It took a long time to get a visa for someone, even to travel from the capital city of Khartoum out to the 5 states where we were working, which were remote rural areas in the west and south of Sudan. Required a long time to get that approval to get on the plane or a helicopter to travel that far. So it was already a very difficult environment to work in, but we were still providing very important health and nutrition and mental health services and providing incentives to Ministry of Health workers. So we were working with and through Ministry of Health facilities to provide services to the host and the displaced populations. When conflict broke out on April 15th, it wasn't a surprise in how tenuous the agreement was, but the ferocity and the speed of the outbreak of violence was very surprising. And our first responsibility was, of course, to our staff, their safety and even their mental health well-being amidst the difficulty of that situation. So we had international staff that we worked with our headquarters security department to evacuate. Even before you saw embassies evacuating their own staff, we found a way to get our staff out. And then we stayed in contact with our national staff, who many of whom were hibernating, as we say, staying in place while they continued to provide support to clinics as possible, moving supplies that we had left out to those clinics. And we are still now supporting 30 of those clinics to provide health services while we're developing our emergency response in response to the displacement and the people affected by conflict.
So a lot of the fighting erupted in Khartoum, the capital city and the major city, right? And that's where the sort of the hub of all of our operations were. So we quickly had to pivot, right, and reestablish our sort of set base of operations in a more secure location. So talk a little bit about how that happened and what we did there.
It really turned things on its head, because where we had bases of operations, where we had offices in Khartoum, in cities in Darfur, such as called Niala, Zelinje, Janina, these were bases where many NGOs and the UN had offices. And from there, we would have supply chains and technical support to Ministry of Health, to rural areas where either there were communities that needed support, or there were camps of displaced people that had been infected by the fighting from 20 years ago. But as you say, because the fighting started in Khartoum, that essentially cut off our staff in Khartoum, and our international staff that we evacuated, but also the people in those capital cities of Niala and Janina. And it led to looting. There was intense fighting in those cities because there was battles for control of those cities. So where we once had bases that were considered relatively safe from which to reach out to people who needed it, now those places became flashpoints for conflict, as you see in these little battle stars on the map. So it really made things difficult. And it also made things difficult for communication. So staying in contact with everyone who was in these very hot areas, particularly West Darfur and Central Darfur.
Right. And so we set up our base in a city called Madani, right? And the first priority was essentially to open up supply lines, right? Because we were, as a matter of course, we were helping support, some 60 clinics, right, throughout the country, delivering, healthcare services. And, quickly we had to pivot and really figure out how to continue to get those supplies in, right? That was sort of priority number one after the safety of our team members.
So that's right. So Madani is a town that's outside of Khartoum. And so many people who were displaced by fighting in Khartoum started moving to Madani, including the authorities, including the government. So it also became a hub for working with authorities, working with our community stakeholders to make plans and to get approvals for movement into the country of medicines. So when the conflict started out, we immediately, inside the organization, we reached out to suppliers, private suppliers of medicines to start the import process, but also the World Health Organization to see what supplies they might have in country. And so Madani was the first place that we reached out. We provided hygiene kits to displaced people because they were seeing that there were some water-related diarrhea issues and other problems. Anytime that people collect in a camp very, very quickly, it's hard for them to reach water. It's hard for them to have the usual kind of sanitation that we would expect. We also then established mobile health and nutrition teams, and we supplied those with World Health Organization kits that they had inside the country. But in the meantime, we've been bringing materials via Jeddah, and we will bring them across the Red Sea with WFP in the next week. And those, once they're cleared, they were originally intended to support hospitals. The original news was that hospitals were being The infrastructure was being destroyed during the fighting. Access to Khartoum right now is not safe. And so we will continue to support the increasing needs for health services in Madani and Sana'a while keeping our eye on Khartoum. At the same time, we're also looking at how do we access those people in need on the western side of the country in the Darfur states I mentioned. And we're talking with a partner called Solidarité and other international NGOs for how we can bring supplies in through the country of Chad, which neighbors Sudan to the west. So those are all things that we meant to do for supply chain, to be poised to, as you say, bring in any support whenever there's a ceasefire or when we can find access. But really, the fighting is so intense and access is so difficult on the western side that our main ambition right now is to keep moving supplies, and we're thinking about moving a logistics coordinator to join Solidarité to be able to really assess how we can do that. And then in the meantime, as you mentioned, there are refugees traveling to the other countries, so we have launched our response there.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, so we have programs and are operational in South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Ethiopia. And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the, movement of people into those areas, and then how we began responding, simultaneously, right? So there was sort of a lot going on, not only inside Sudan, but in those surrounding countries.
It's a regional response, so it's a multi-country response. And as you say, we've been in South Sudan for decades. It's one of our oldest country programs. We've been in Central African Republic, which is to the west of Sudan, Ethiopia, for a long time. And refugees were starting to move out into these countries within a week of the conflict starting in Khartoum. So I made phone calls to those country directors in those countries, and with the flexibility that's provided with the kind of contributions from the people who are listening on this call, we were able to start mobile emergency health services in those countries as really one of the first NGOs to do that. South Sudan wasn't easy. It's way up north in a place called Renk. We had to rent a boat to get our team there. And even now with the rainy season, you need a plane to access it. But we have been providing services there for health and nutrition. And as some people are actually South Sudanese who are returning to South Sudan, as well as Sudanese coming across the border. And some of them are going as far as a city called Malakal, which is about in the north, but a larger town where we already had a very big program. So we're receiving them. And some people are continuing on as far as the capital city of Juba. So a lot of migration that's moving in Central African Republic, where it's a very challenging context. It's insecure, it's remote. The road to where the refugees were crossing is unsafe. We also established immediate services within, 2 or 3 days, while UN and other agencies were still thinking about it. So again, it's great to be a non-governmental organization that can move quickly while we coordinate with the United Nations and coordinate with governments and authorities. We still, having that independence and having that neutrality enables us to access these places where people are in need. And so the United Nations can provide support and coordination, but NGOs like us were able to move quickly to save lives.
Right.
In Ethiopia, the same story. So people were coming across. So those programs are continuing. And as I mentioned, we're looking at how we can move supplies in through Chad. This is a regional response. And it's not looking like the situation is going to end soon. This isn't a short outbreak of violence. It's a battle for power. And it's spread across the entire country in major cities. The entire nation is affected. And so we're dug in to provide services for as long as it takes. And luckily, we've had very stable, very professional programs in the countries around Sudan that can continue to support it.
Right. I mean, I think it just might be interesting for some of our listeners. I mean, when you talked about South Sudan and traveling to meet the displaced people, the refugees by boat, and then similarly in CAR. I mean, the rainy season is a real challenge, right, upcoming for that. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about how that, what conditions are like, and the concern that we have that, especially in CAR, that these communities might get cut off because of to access, I mean, usually in the normal course of business, we pre-position supplies for those months, right? We try not to have to bring and work through, by delivering those supplies during the rainy season because it's so difficult, right?
Rainy season's always a challenge, but that's what we do. We problem solve, and it won't mean that we will stop supporting. It just means you need to find other ways to do it. It might get a bit more wet. The spiders are bigger, the lizards are bigger, and there's more bugs. But we will continue to support those services. Luckily, we had. I mean, I wouldn't say luckily, but the conflict started before rainy season started, so we were already moving and supporting before this started. So, and we've been working in these places for a long time. We know how to work during rainy season. I mean, when I say spiders are big, they're about as big as your fist. So, and the snakes surprise you when you're walking between tents.
Right.
So but we'll manage.
Right, of course, of course. Well, let's talk about some of the services that we're delivering to these communities. I mean, it's the same. I mean, all of these communities, these displaced or refugee communities. I mean, I think one of the hallmarks of International Medical Corps' work is that sort of integrating the services that we can offer, right? So health and nutrition. I mean, of course, these people, are low income to start with and the most vulnerable in the sense of having little or no resources to protect themselves from these kinds of movements and things. Maybe you could talk about some of that service provision that we're delivering.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, International Medical Corps, we are known for providing an integrated package, as we call it, a one-stop shop as much as we can, where, we are medical corps, providing healthcare, including reproductive health care for pregnant women, and families, but also nutrition. So, families are affected by not having enough food. Children become sick when they're traveling and become underweight. People are affected by the conflict and they are stressed. They may need what we call psychosocial services or even something more advanced like mental health services and need counseling. So we train doctors in how to identify those people while they're providing health services. We also then set up water points in these places, or we set up latrines so that it's a healthier place to settle while people are moving. All of these things, if you can imagine going camping with nothing in your backpack and you arrive at your campsite, what would you need? Those are the kind of things that we provide, as well as trying to provide for the emotional care of people. And a lot of times these families are separated. They may have had to leave their parents behind, or people who are disabled behind, or they bring them along, and that's especially challenging for them. A lot of times they need to be in contact. So they might need just a mobile phone charger to be in contact with someone else. You can imagine if you had to flee your home, in California, there are wildfires and people flee their homes, the basic needs. And that's the life-saving services that we're talking about. If you didn't have clean water or a place to sleep. And we don't work alone. We do collaborate with other NGOs that might, let's say we don't do everything. We don't build tents. Well, they might be building the tents, or, other organizations might be distributing the food products, and while we're helping the children to recover from being malnourished. So it's a team effort. And the more that we coordinate and collaborate and are accountable for what we're doing, sharing the results of what we're doing with the community, hearing whether or not that's what they needed, what else we could do, sharing the results with our contributors, with our donors transparently, also letting them know what works and what doesn't work so they can adapt what they're going to fund. When we are the first on the ground, we are able to share that information, but it also attracts additional donations from government donors or from private donors. So when they see that we used our private funds, $20,000, $30,000, but we were there first and we're able to do the work, then they start chipping in, maybe $1 million, $2 million, and it becomes a longer term program, a bigger program that we say goes to scale. But it means that we're not just there for 3 weeks. It means that we can continue to be there and maybe provide more support as they travel along to other areas.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned that this is probably a long-term affair. I mean, sort of where do you see things going in the next 3 to 6 months? I mean, what do you think international medical corps response will look like, and what do you think conditions on the ground will be?
Um, Irregardless of whether the conflict continues, the people's immediate needs will be there for some time. The markets have been affected, so just access to basic food and healthcare. Healthcare facilities have been destroyed. Offices have been destroyed. The UNICEF warehouse in Khartoum was burnt. These kinds of emergency supplies still need to come into the country. So the way that we've pre-positioned and poised ourselves, for when we can access, we will continue to need to do that to bring in support. And then, as we have always done in conflict-affected countries, including Sudan, working with and through the communities, working with the institutions that are meant to provide healthcare for their own people. The mandate of International Medical Corps since we began in Afghanistan has always been to support local healthcare providers, train them in the skills, give them some materials so that they then can expand access to their own communities and their own neighbors. So that's what we'll continue to do. We'll continue to inject our support so that those Sudanese can and people around Sudan can provide those services.
Right. Well, I just want to invite anyone on the call, if you have any questions, to drop them in the Q&A chat, and we will try to get to them. But maybe, is there anything that you think we've missed that's important to make a note of for our listeners?
As I said, Darfur has been in our living memory for quite some time, and the challenges that people were facing are still challenges today. I remember when I worked there, in a place that actually just got looted. We heard in West Darfur this week it got looted, which I'm very sad to hear because I was there for a year living with the community. I had a very personal experience there where these huts that the people lived in have grass roofs, thatch roofs, and we had set up our own fire brigade with sand buckets, because when there was a fire in the camp, all the roofs would catch fire and have a wildfire across the camp.
Right.
And this is the kind of conditions that people lived in. They lived in what we call tupels, mud huts with thatch roofs. And we responded to the fire, dumped our sand, and put out the fire with the community. And as I was walking back, I met a man whose feet had been burned in the fire. And I knew him. He was very kind, and he was a very brave man. He wasn't complaining. But I gave him my shoes, and the look that he had in his eyes of such appreciation and gratitude was, for me, worth it all. So I always want to remember that these people are facing such difficult conditions, and the gratitude is so strong for any kind of contribution that we can make. That's what drives me, is remembering that those people, your average Joe, is being affected by these very, very extreme conditions, and to stay present, to stay engaged, to stay there through this whole difficult time, and continue doing the good work that we do.
That's good. Well, just because we have a little bit of time left, and we don't seem to have any questions in the Q&A. Oh, there's a couple that came in. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how conditions on the ground in neighboring regions, especially like Ethiopia, that's been experiencing its own conflict, are being impacted or exacerbating the conflict in Sudan. I mean, is that happening?
I think it's a destabilizing risk to the region. I would not say that yet that it has affected places like Ethiopia and their own issues so far. But the longer that Sudan is unstable, the more impact it will have. I mean, unfortunately, in these regions, we have refugees moving back and forth between countries all the time because we have conflicts even inside between tribes and ethnicities. So, no, so far, I don't think that I would say that it's had a tangible exacerbating effect.
Okay. And then we have another question. What has been some of the most challenging features of this emergency response? There was already a general sense before the Sudan conflict and after Ukraine that donors had grown fatigued for financing new emergencies. How has that impacted our response in Ukraine? Can we give examples of how our needs have increased? And I think you mentioned dealing with authorities, but maybe you can talk a little bit about how you have to navigate sort of both sides of the conflict there. You know, there's
You
several
mentioned
factors.
Ukraine, so is the interest
I
also in
think
how it's affected?
that's really around financing fatigue, right? Sort of donations fatigue. I mean, how do you feel about the response, and do we have the resources that we need?
It's a very good question because the flip side of being in a country for a very long time is that it's not in the news, and donors do have less and less, especially after so much went to Ukraine. And so we are making do with much of what we already had. Because of our response, the American government did give us a couple $1 million more, and we may get some more, but it's not nearly what you would expect compared to the needs. And other governments are thinking about what they can do. I think part of the problem was not to get into the business side of things, but a lot of them had already committed their funds for Sudan for 2023, and then this happened. So they had to scramble and figure out what they could do. This, in my career, this is one, and I've talked with many people who've been in the business for a while. This is one of the most challenging and weird responses that we've had to do. As I mentioned, Sudan was already a difficult place to work because the authorities had two different opposing military forces in the same panel that would be reviewing your application for something. So there were a lot of politics involved in that. And now, with conflict in cities that used to be hubs for how we thought before, it's very hard to reach staff. It's very hard to bring in supplies. It's unpredictable in terms of when fighting will break out in a town. The banking system stopped for a long time, so we couldn't bring money into the country. We're just now starting to be able to do that, and so you can imagine the knock-on effects of being able to pay for renting a new office or renting a vehicle, or these kinds of things, buying supplies. Getting supplies into the country, with the authorities now, they're now getting back in place, but for a while it was hard to know who you asked to bring in medicines into the country. So it's, and the fact that you have really almost two sides of the country with very, very different challenges. And the fact that we had, after the conflict, we evacuated our international staff, and they're in Nairobi. Two have gotten back into Sudan, into Port Sudan on the sea, but most of them are in Nairobi. So we're doing much of our support remotely for the national staff who are hard to reach. So it is a really, really challenging. So if I seem a little tired, it's because I've been on calls for the last 4 hours in LA. And that's while we're also trying to, in my region, manage 8 other countries, including Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, South Sudan, and so it's challenging for everybody.
Right. Well, one other question that came through on the chat are sort of what are the top medical needs for Sudan inside the country right now? I mean, and so are we running out of medicines, basic medicines?
Well, happily, this import that's now in Jeddah should reach, if all things going well, would get into the country and clear customs in the next week or so. And that would support our medical services that are in the eastern side. On the western side, the Ministry of Health facilities that we are supporting, we we've been able to move what remained left of our stocks. It is important that we're able to bring in new stocks to continue services. But it is a difficult situation for that. And when a UNICEF warehouse or something becomes burned, that also makes it even harder to get supplies from the UN, for example. In terms of the medical needs, trauma care, but also just basic medical needs that anyone would need day to day. And let's not forget people who are diabetic or need, have chronic conditions. They need their, or people who even have mental health issues, and then suddenly they can't get their medication. So it's not just the life-saving services, it's also maintaining people's access to what they relied on.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned the region that you oversee, and I think most people outside the humanitarian community didn't expect this conflict to erupt in Sudan and didn't see this need coming on. And I think that there are, I mean, you mentioned Somalia and Afghanistan, I mean, two countries that have really struggled, for decades, and have sort of fallen off people's radar screen. I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the ongoing needs in Afghanistan and Somalia, and what our teams are doing there.
Well, Somalia, we have great teams in both those countries. Somalia, while there are still conflict-related issues, hit and run attacks, bombings that destabilize the country. And in Somalia, it's the only country where you do need to move with armed escort. So when you ride in an armored car, which when the air conditioning doesn't work is like a hot box, and then you drive behind a pickup truck full of guys with AK-47s. It's not easy to sit underneath a tree and have tea with the villagers, because you can only stay somewhere about a half hour before you need to move on for your safety. But the drought that we saw in the last years or so wasn't one of the most extremes droughts that we've seen in decades, and it meant that people didn't have access to water, their livestock were dying. Same problem in Ethiopia. It was a regional problem. And these people, their livestock is a part of their family. So nomads became displaced people and started to gather in towns where they could access support or health services. And so we were supporting that and receiving them, but also trying to find ways to give them access to water. One of the interesting things we did was a solar-powered pump in a camp that the people themselves helped pay for the maintenance for. So they recognized the value of that. In Afghanistan, of course, it continues to be a real concern that women's rights to access to healthcare, to education, and even, their husbands and fathers and children. It's a very depressing situation, especially if you imagine being a young guy in your 20s who used to, before the Taliban returned, would ride around in your car and listen to rock music on your radio. They have Rick and Morty t-shirts, and they can't do that now. They get stopped on the street. It can be hard to have developing freedoms and then have all of that restricted. And but in the meantime, we've been in Afghanistan. That's where IMC was born, and we have some staff who've worked with us for decades. And our deputy country director, Dr. Shamail, she's a bastion. She's one of the mainstays of our program. And despite being a woman, even when the Taliban took authority, even when there was an edict that women could not work in NGOs, she kept it going, even when international staff had to evacuate during the turnover of government. Our female staff in Afghanistan are working. They're providing health services. We've adapted. We are engaging with the authorities, and we always have. And we have never stopped working in Afghanistan in 40 years, which not a lot of NGOs, not many can say. And it's because we maintain our neutrality, we stay practical, we stay flexible, and we have really strong Afghan staff who are very committed.
Right. Well, I think that's a theme of, sort of what's come out of your comments today is that our colleagues on the ground are the ones that are committed to responding to these different emergencies, and they really are the backbone of International Medical Corps' work and response. And so, I mean, maybe you can just sign off by kind of, sharing, how that, is motivating and gives us all, some hope for the future.
It is motivating because these are, you meet some amazing heroes in these countries who you can't help but admire. They're just, good people and intelligent, and they might do what they do even if we didn't pay them. They're just good-hearted. But luckily, they do become employees and they do become people who grow in their careers with the International Medical Corps. We have our current country director in Afghanistan. He started as a pharmacist. He's a Syrian. His family were refugees, and he's grown a career, and now he's our country director working with Dr. Shmail in Afghanistan. So people do grow. They learn management skills. They learn healthcare technical skills, engineering skills, and and grow as people as well. So it gives people who are refugees or displaced people an opportunity to build a life, and that gives them hope. And it's just a pleasure to meet them in the field and see the work that they do directly with the communities who are also very committed to helping each other. I mean, when these crises happen, the communities are helping themselves first, and we then join in to inject what we can. We're just kind of supporting and injecting support, with the help of the people who are listening. That's what we're doing, is enabling them in these very difficult situations.
Right. Well, thanks, Dave, for your time. I know that you have a lot going on, and we appreciate you sharing your overview of what's happening in Sudan and the region, and then touching on some of the other emergencies. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your support, and look forward to continuing to share International Medical Corps' work across the world. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Dave, for being here with us today.
Thanks, everyone.